Hello. So right now we are going to talk about late medieval and proto-Renaissance. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a map of Italy because today we are focusing on Italy. And then we'll go ahead and take a look at some images and kind of talk about the historical context of the times, and then move into important artists such as Giotto. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so we are looking specifically at Italy. And you can see here on the left, this is indicating where the kingdoms are. Okay, so the brown is one kingdom of Florence, the papal states. So papal it means pope, right? So this is controlled by the pope. So Vatican City, etc. And as you can see, it's quite large. It has a lot of power at the time. And the Kingdom of Naples, etc. And on the right, you can see a map more like we are accustomed to with Genoa, Milan, Rome, okay? Vatican City within Rome, all right? So that would be here, just to kind of give you a feel for where we are. So as discussed in the previous lecture, Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, is extremely important. It is the central aspect of life. So Catholic means universal, and the word Catholic is actually used to mean that, as opposed to a religion at times. So that use of the word is still occurring. And basically, right, so think about life in medieval times. You have a very hierarchical society. You are born into wealth and power, or you are born into poverty, right? They have a feudal system at this point in time, like in the Middle Ages. So it's a very stratified society, okay? And life is hard. So your focus is on the afterlife. And remember how we talked about, oh, I guess it is right there. We talked about how Dante has hell, right? And then purgatory is in between hell and heaven. And so you can see here kind of an amusing depiction of the 7 circles of hell. But basically, the way that you would achieve salvation is to follow the sacraments. So those are the 7 sacraments mentioned before, including baptism. We talked about how a baby needs to be baptized so that if they die, their soul doesn't go to purgatory, etc. And they need to follow the preaching of the church. So basically, anything major that happens in the church. Other sacraments include marriage, last rites, etc. The church's power at this time is absolute. So let me go ahead and get started over here. So this is Luna, okay? So remember how we briefly looked at this altarpiece of the 7 sacraments, and here on the right-hand side, you can see the last rites. So someone is dying and they are being read their last rites so that they will be assured of going to heaven. So the church's power is visible in all aspects of life across all ranks, okay? So the Bible is in Latin. All religious texts are in Latin, meaning that it's inaccessible to anyone but the clergy. So you have to have the clergy, because how else will you be saved, right? You need their knowledge. You need their ability to save you. And the clergy are automatically saved, but lay people are not. They have to earn their salvation. And one thing about Catholicism at this time is that the more money you spend to glorify God, the better off you are in the next life, basically is what it comes down to. And that sort of money can look different. It could be tithing, which is giving a portion of your salary to the church, donor portraits. So you would have these massive altarpieces in churches, and so the donor who paid for that altarpiece would often have themselves painted into the painting, into the altarpiece, so that it was visible to all what they had done and increase their chances of salvation. There's also something called an indulgence, and this was a piece of paper that you would buy that was, not to make light of it, but essentially a get out of jail free card. And these were expensive, but you could purchase these to offset your sins so that you would be assured of getting into heaven or to spend less time in purgatory. You could also provide funding for nuns and monks to say prayers around the clock for your soul, for the soul of your family, etc. So there are a lot of different ways that you could assure salvation, and they often involved having some sort of means, monetary means. Okay, so we looked at these icons, right? And we talked about, well, I talked about various aspects, like the fact that these are not naturalistic, that is intentional. It's flattened, the use of gold, the lack of backgrounds, right? Because these are not in an earthly setting, it's in a heavenly setting, and consider the atmosphere, the light reflecting off the gold, etc. So the way that an artwork would be created in this time was by commission. Okay, so you would not create art because you felt so moved. You would not create art to express yourself necessarily. You would create art at the behest or the request of some individual who would pay you for this. And some amount of creativity is allowed, but they would have very specific contracts, and we still have some of these contracts, and they specify exactly how much gold has to be used in terms of weight, or how much of it has to be done by the master artist as opposed to pupils in his workshop. Okay, and I say he because almost all artists that we know of practicing at this time were men, although there were nuns, females, who were painting book illustrations, etc., but it's not well documented. So think about even the word masterpiece, right? It involves inherently masculine language, master, right? Not mistress. It's a very gendered word, and that's because traditionally art history has been seen as a man's province, and women's work is not worthy of being included in the art historical canon. So what you would study in a class like this, because women's work has traditionally been more domestic. So fiber arts, quilting, etc., possibly ceramics, and also for the higher classes, there could be some painting, but it was usually more watercolor, etc., of plants, if that even happened. So anyway, okay, bunny trail. Okay, so moving on, artists at this time also had guilds. So these were groups of artists and also other mediums, not just the arts, so, or what we consider the arts today. So you would have painters, but you would also have metalworking and textiles, and these groups would moderate quality, and you would have to apply in order to be in a guild and to prove your skill. So basically it was a way of these guilds being able to make sure that work produced in this area met a certain quality, a certain standard. And so in order to become an artist, you would be apprenticed, you would work in a workshop, and you would slowly build your way up to being able to be your own master. Okay. There are a couple of concepts that I want to introduce to you, which is art historical concepts. And one of them is iconography. So this is symbolism, and it refers to the study of subject rather than the forms in the work of arts. And it's a visual shorthand. So for example, a heart stands for love. And we're going to, in modern times, we're going to see a lot more of iconography in the coming weeks. It will be especially apparent in the Northern Renaissance, where something like a lily symbolizes purity, etc. So there's a lot of meaning. None of these elements in the paintings that we're going to see are random or unintentional, okay? So let's go ahead and talk medieval, late medieval. So early medieval, we have these flat, rigid structures that are compartmentalized. You have planes of color, right? There's very little modeling, very flattened figures. And again, this is not due to a lack of talent. This is intentional. So in the late medieval period, you have altarpieces, which start to become the primary artistic products in the 13th century. So an altarpiece is a typically massive artwork that's often hinged, and it would have art on the front and on the wings, so it would be closed, and then on feast days, it would open. So this is a really big deal. So you would have something on the outside as well as on the inside, and these were devotional objects. Okay, so there's an increasing number of altarpieces, and today we're going to start out with a specific artist whose name is Chiambue. Oddly enough, the name means ox head. It's a nickname. He's a contemporary of Dante. Okay, so he starts to move away from the incredibly flat, right? So consider again the folds of the garment that Jesus wears, right? There's no attempt at modeling here. It's simply striations. And it's very clear that this is not intended to be modeled, okay? But if we start to look at Chiambue's work, all right, and look at this, 1268 to 1271, he is starting to introduce more depth, more naturalism, more movement, okay? So if you look at this work specifically, you can see that Christ is not a static figure, okay? He's moving, okay? He's kind of twisting in anguish, all right? You can see this, and look at even this, and I apologize, this is not a super great image, but look at his drapery, okay? Look at the difference in the way that the drapery is modeled. So he is moving towards a more naturalistic representation. It's still not incredibly natural looking, but again, right, there's more of an attempt to create a sense of depth with these figures. All right, so do you see how flat this robe is and the lack of modeling on the chin? Oops, sorry, wrong way. But you can see that there's more modeling here. There's some shadows to indicate the plane of the jaw melting into the neck, okay? Same here, so this would be St. John the Evangelist, and this is the Virgin Mary, okay? Christ is crucified in the middle, and he has a slightly more emotionally vivid face, okay? So he's not stoic, he's not like a mask, right? He looks like he is potentially in pain. He looks like he's suffering, right? So we're starting to see a little bit more of the emotion coming forward here, okay? So this is the very, very, very beginning of the Proto-Renaissance. Okay, and so this is the rise of vernacular, and we're going to get into that next week, where people, the masses, start to be able to have access to printed books, and they start to be able to learn to read, okay, and the vernacular, right? So everyday language. What's being published is not necessarily in Latin, which is the official governmental and religious language. And so this is a really huge deal. And authors like Dante start publishing in the vernacular. So think about, for you, I mean, it would be like, for most of you, I'm assuming you do not know Latin. And so if everything was published in Latin, you would be out of luck, right? So only scholars and people in certain sciences can speak Latin. So it's something similar here. So think about the difference between all books being published in Latin to some books published in Latin, some books published in English or whatever your first language is. Okay, so there's this big shift away. So we're still going to see in art things like medieval tendencies with Renaissance advances, right? So you still see this body is not particularly naturalistic. Even the drapery is still flattened, but there's a movement towards adding a sense of depth and space. And yet there's still this compression, right? This flattening. So if we keep moving, this is another Chiambue, and this is a Madonna. So this figure can be called Virgin and Child or Madonna and Child, enthroned Madonna. So you will typically see the Virgin Mary holding a young Jesus Christ, and she's usually dressed in a similar manner. Okay, so let's look at what we're seeing here. We see the Madonna and Jesus and some angels as well as saints on the side. Now, what do you notice in terms of size? Okay, so the Virgin Mary is female, and on either side of her are men. And typically, not always, but typically, men tend to be taller than women. But that's not the case here. So what we're looking at here is a hierarchical depiction. So there's a hierarchy. The more important figure is bigger. Okay, so that's what we're seeing here. And you can see that this is actually an enthroned Madonna because she is, let me click on this so that goes away. She is sitting on a throne here, okay? So think about the absolute flatness of, let me bring up what we were looking at before with the icons. Sorry, give me just one sec here. Okay, so, right, look at these flat icons, okay? So this is an icon from roughly the same time, 1265, and look at how this is modeled. This is also an enthroned Madonna, okay? But there's no attempt to create a sense of depth. This is very flat and very decorative. But if we compare it here, do you see how there's shading to create this sense of her knee pressing against the fabric? Okay, you can see that this shading is also apparent elsewhere on her body. And so this is an attempt to create three-dimensional naturalistic space with the sense of a body, a human body created in 3D underneath the fabric. And you can feel it kind of pushing forward, okay? So compare these two and think about how revolutionary this is to depict the skirt in this way, okay? So look at that. See how there's foreshortening here? So for those of you who may not be aware, foreshortening is the concept that when you see something straight on, it is, it becomes kind of like you lose some of the depth. So, okay, if you look at my picture, I'm punching the camera right now, right? And all you see is the fist. And if you do see some arm, it's very small, but really my arm is like 1.5 feet long, but you can't see that here when I punch towards the camera. So that's the concept of foreshortening. Okay, so we have Chiambue, sorry. And you can still see medieval tendencies, right? The hierarchy, the flat gold background. The Madonna still looks pretty similar to these sorts of Madonnas with the inclined head and the face, but it's still more naturalistic. There's more modeling, there's more shading. Okay, another Chiambue, and again, the sense of hierarchy. One thing that you may not be aware of, which this might strike you a little bit odd, is, there we go. Okay, this one's a better image. So if you see figures with something odd about them, So sometimes you'll see someone with a stone embedded in his head, etc. Those are typically saints, and what you're seeing is called the attribute. And that identifies who they are. The attribute usually has to do with either what they did during their life or the way in which they were martyred, which is someone who's killed for their religion. Okay, so that's Chiambue. And Chiambue is said to be the teacher of Giotto. Okay, so you can see how Giotto is taking inspiration from Chiambue and he's pushing it even further. So here it is. Okay, so here is the Chiambue Madonna that we were just looking at, and the discussion of the weight of the body underneath the fabric. Okay, and look at the knee. Look at the knees here. Okay, so you can see that it's even more naturalistic. Okay, and if we zoom in, we can see that there is this sense, not just on the knees, which obviously project forward by a lot, but you can also see pushing against the breasts. And at this time, the breasts of the Virgin are not seen as erotic. They have to do with being maternal and nurturing because of the connotations of breast milk. Okay, so this would not be sacrilegious to indicate that she has breasts, etc. So if we look at the face, okay, the face is becoming much more naturalistic. Again, this is a Chiambue, and this is 1280 to 1290, whereas this Madonna is 20 to 30 years later. Okay, so the face is there is a chin, but there's really not much of a jawline. Here we have a very distinct jawline. The eyes are still not entirely naturalistic, but it is moving towards a much more natural appearance. And you can see that this throne, unlike other thrones that we have seen, so for instance, this throne, right, is very flat. There's an attempt to create a three-dimensionality to the throne, but it still looks very flat. It's pressed up against the front of the image. And this one, you can see that there is a clear attempt to create this foreshortening of the background. So you can tell that this is a Gothic sort of arch and that it has quite a lot of depth. But it's not fully Renaissance, right? It's not fully new. Hang on just a sec. Sorry. So what we're looking at is still a flat gold background. The throne has depth, but there is no background. So again, this is a scene that is taken out of this world and placed into an otherworldly context. We're seeing hierarchy again, so the size of the Madonna compared to the angels. Okay, you have these flat gold halos behind the angels, etc. But the features are becoming much more delicate, much more natural. Okay, so compare with these angels, right? So there's a lot of difference here. So again, really pushing the bounds. He's using shadows to create a sense of space. And he creates these figures that are weighty, but they have this sense of heroic stillness, which is seen as a hallmark of Christian art during the Italian Renaissance. Okay. So he's enabling viewers to identify with the religious figures that he's portraying. So we saw some movement towards depicting natural human emotions in these religious figures with Chiambue, and we see this being pushed even further with Giotto. All right, so, okay. This is a painting by Giotto for the Scrivini Chapel or the Arena Chapel. And let me, hang on, here we go. Okay, so a few things that I want to point out. This is a chapel, and here you can see that this is blue. So this blue is created by the use of lapis lazuli. So I mentioned that lapis lazuli is a semi-precious stone. And in order to create this pigment, you would have to grind the stone up and mix it with oils, etc. So this is a very expensive pigment. So think about the fact that there's just this blanket of lapis lazuli blue, okay? And there are gold stars painted into it, all right? This is a huge undertaking. Think about all the work that would have to go into making this, okay? And even here, where it looks like sculptural marble panels, you kind of see how this is marble. This is all painted. Even these figures, which seem to be carved, are not. They are painted. And so this idea of creating the illusion of something like sculpture, where it's really flat, etc., this is called trompe-l'œil or trompe-l'œil. And this means to fool the eye. Okay, and so that's something that we're going to see a lot of. And this is a really big deal, right? So we have not been seeing trompe-l'œil in something like this, right? There's no attempt to fool the eye. This is clearly not of our world. So this is really a very special undertaking. So this is called the Arena Chapel, and it was built for the Scrivini family. And the Scrivini family are money lenders. And in order to know why they would need to make a chapel this grand, you would need to know that biblically, money lenders are condemned. It's seen as unbiblical to lend money and charge interest for it. Okay, so they have a lot of sins that they are trying to wipe off their slate. They are trying to buy their way into heaven, essentially, is what it comes down to. And this chapel features scenes from the life of Christ and the life of the Virgin Mary. So you have the life of the Virgin. So this is Jesus's mother here at the top. And then both of these rows are the life of Christ. And do you see how we have three distinct rows? These are called registers. So the top register is Mary, and then the bottom two are life of Christ. And again, the life of Christ relates back to the stick figures that I showed you previously. And at the end, we have the Last Judgment. Okay, so for those of you who may not know, the Last Judgment is at the end of times, and the apocalypse occurs, and Jesus calls the souls up from the earth, from all who have died, those who are still alive, and he weighs those souls into the good and the evil. And as you might imagine, the good can go to heaven and the evil descend into hell. So on Jesus's right-hand side, you can see the good, all right? And how do you know that they're good? Well, they have halos, that's a good start, but they also are depicted in these pastel sort of colors. It's orderly, it's very neat, it's very calm. And on the left-hand side, you see hell, okay? And here you can see the devil and demons tormenting these souls who are being cast into the pits of hell. And then you have saints here, martyrs, angels, etc. And obviously this is Christ here in the center. Apologies if I didn't say that. And another thing that I should mention is that God in the Christian religion is a trinity, or three parts. So there's Jesus, or Jesus Christ, there's God the Father, and there's the Holy Spirit. So these are three parts, but they're all one. And so that's why you might hear me use different terms for God. And here, right here, at the bottom of this cross, you can see that there's a man kneeling, and there are angels, and there's something going on. So let me show you what that is. Here it is. Okay, so do you remember how I was saying that you could donate money, right? And you could have something like a donor portrait on the altarpiece. This is what you're seeing here. This is what's called a donor portrait. So this is the Arena Chapel, or the Scrivini Chapel, from the outside, what it would look like. And here you see the head of the Scrivini family, and he is offering this chapel to angels and saints and to God, okay? And I don't know if you noticed where he is, but he is on the right-hand side. So he is on the side of those who are saved. He is not on the side of eternal damnation. Okay, so this is a depiction of his sacrifice and the fact that he hopes that this gift will be accepted by God and will grant him entry into heaven. Okay, and this is a donor portrait, and we're going to see a lot more of that. So this is a really, really fascinating chapel, and we're going to look at a few of the paintings by Giotto. So give me just a second here. So you are seeing here the betrayal where Christ is being kissed by Judas. So let me bring over my handy dandy Life of Christ. Okay, so what you're seeing is the betrayal here where Judas kisses Jesus. Okay, and so this is Judas kissing Jesus. And so again, we have this attempt to create a sense of depth by the way that the people are stacked. So we have seen stacking like this, where it's all vertical, instead of creating more accurate depictions of a crowd where they get smaller and farther away. Okay, you're still seeing things like the golden halo. It's still flat, but we have some really interesting innovations, right? So look at this figure here. He has his back to us. And that's not something that we've seen. We've seen very strictly frontal or possibly profile pictures up until this point. So this is really kind of remarkable. And most of the paintings, within this chapel are remarkable in this way. Okay, so this is the crucifixion, which I don't know if this helps you or not, but it's right here, right, where Jesus dies. This is the flight into Egypt. So that would be where Herod is killing all the babies because he wants to remain king of the Jews. Okay, so that's why I created that, to kind of help you figure out what all these images mean. So this is a really famous work by Giotto, and it's called The Lamentation, and it's made just after 1300. Okay, so think about that. This is over 700 years old. And let's look at what we're seeing. So the Lamentation is after the crucifixion and before the burial. So Jesus's body has been taken down from the cross, and it is nothing more than a body at this point. He is dead. And so his family and his friends and his apostles are mourning him. And that's what we're looking at here. Okay, so I mentioned iconography. So one thing standing in for another. And you can see here that there is a tree in the upper right-hand side, but it's completely bare. There are no leaves, right? So that symbolizes barrenness and Christ dying and loss, right? And think about the depth of emotion that we have seen up until this point, okay? Look at these faces. These faces are clearly people who are suffering. Even if their eyes and their mouth are perhaps not entirely naturalistic, it is clear that there is emotion being experienced. There are even these really dramatic gestures. So this is St. John the Evangelist, and he's throwing his arms back rather violently in his grief. Okay, and then we have, again, this innovation of showing their back to us. And look, you can see here the way that the folds of the drapery fall. Giotto is trying to create a sense of coextensive space. Coextensive space is where the figures in the picture plane come out into our space to create this more naturalistic effect, right? So again, this focus is we're moving a bit towards the emphasis on the individual, the way that we saw with the classical art. So this emphasis on emotion. And then we have these wonderful angels, these cherubs, right? And look at this foreshortening, right? So this shortening of the depth to show that something is coming towards us. Okay, so a lot of foreshortening, which is not something that we've seen, and we see anguish on their faces. Now, one thing that you might be noticing is that you have these kind of odd demarcations, right? So you can kind of see there and here, and it makes it look kind of choppy. It's a little bit confusing. And the reason for that is that this is a fresco. So a fresco is where a painting is created on a wall, and the paint becomes part of the plaster. So it's actually a very durable form of painting. So unlike painting on a canvas or a wooden panel, the paint can flake off on those. On here, it chemically bonds into the wall. So the way that this works is that you would dampen the wall and then coat it with plaster. And then you would draw on the design, and then you would paint in sections. And the sections are known as giornate. That means 1 day's work. And so you can see here that this would be 1 day's work. Okay, so this section is 1 day, right? This angel appears to be probably 1 day here. Okay, and so you would only wet as much of the plaster as you thought that you could get done that day. And you would have to go back and re-wet the plaster in order to get it to chemically set with the paints. And we're not going to see frescoes everywhere. We see them in various parts of Italy. Okay, but we're not going to see them in places like Venice. Venice is hang on, I'm trying to get my bearings here, sorry. Geography is sometimes a little tricky for me. Okay, here we go. So here's Venice, right here. And you can see that it's right on the water, right? So Venice has the canals, and you're not going to see a lot of frescoes in Venice because it's too damp. So it has to be the right climate in order for frescoes to work. And that is more appropriate somewhere like Rome, okay? Someplace more in the middle, someplace with sunshine and not a lot of humidity, okay? And these are called a series or a cycle. So the chapel, these registers depict cycles, right? So the life of Christ is one cycle or one series. So you can see how these are very innovative, especially compared to what came before, but there are still elements of the medieval in them. And here you can see the Lamentation here and other scenes, okay? And then this here is an illusion. It's the tremplin here in the center, okay? So again, showing you what the Arena Chapel itself looks like. And I'm going to just oh yeah. So look at how much there is here. Everything is painted, everything. Look at this. It's really, really incredible. Okay, look at that. The ceiling, everything. It's mind-blowing, all right? And we start to have things like the Florence Cathedral. And so there starts to be innovation in building, something that would allow for a dome like this. So we saw the Notre Dame Cathedral, okay? And it has, for instance, this rounded section, but then there are also these, and these are called flying buttresses. And these basically prop the building up, keep it from falling. And so we're starting to see a more mathematical approach to creating art, which extends to architecture and allows for innovations like this, all right? So this is a very famous altarpiece, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but you can see how it is a combination of the medieval and the Proto-Renaissance. And this is roughly the same time as the Arena Chapel. It's 1308 to 11, right? You can see that there's attempt to create a sense of depth by the way the people are stacked, and yet it's still flattened in terms of gold. And you have these various narrative scenes. So often the center will be some sort of enthroned Madonna, etc. And then you will have a narrative laid out in various scenes on the bottom, same thing on the top here. So the flat gold background, you can see that there is an attempt to create the sense of depth with the knee, etc. But again, the face has a very medieval tint to it, etc. And this is the back of the altarpiece. So again, these are very impressive works. And we'll get more into altarpieces later. The last thing that I want to show you is this set of paintings, and this is called Allegory of Good and Bad Government. Okay, so we have seen up until this point from the medieval period, we've seen primarily religious paintings. We had the very occasional portrait, but there has not really been much painting that is created other than to glorify God. So this is a fresco, which again, it's the wet plaster with the wet paint so that they chemically bond. And it is revolutionary for its time for depicting this landscape, okay? And these are called the Allegory of Good and Bad Government. And so it shows what happens if the government is good versus bad. And what we're seeing here is good, right? There's peace, you have the landscape, you have farming, and it's intended to exhort the people of the town, the leaders of the town, to create good government, a healthy government. Okay, so this is secular rather than religious, which is not common up until this point. And it suggests not only that the government is good, but that citizens can help by working in accordance with the natural order of things like seasons and planets. Okay, and this is 1338 to 39. So this is a bit later, about 30 years later than the Arena Chapel. So that is where I'm going to wrap up for the Proto-Renaissance. And we are going to see early Renaissance and Renaissance works in Italy in the next lecture. And one really big turning point is the Black Death, which comes in 1348. And the Black Death actually kills almost 50% of the population in Europe, and it ends the Proto-Renaissance. So there are a lot of really talented artists, creators who just, they died, right? So think about how many people it would have to be in order for half the population to be wiped out. So this is a really monumental event, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in the next lecture.